Hello, this is Professor Hosselman, History 105 Online, and today we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment and despotism. So, in the last lecture, we discussed the Ancien Regime and the development of this hierarchical system that had existed since the medieval period, and its eventual kind of breaking up into different areas. And so, instead of just being the rich and the poor, we're now starting to get this middle class that starts to develop. Now, while European societies seem to have changed little from the Middle Ages, European thinkers, including Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, were absorbing, spreading, and expanding on the ideas of their predecessors, including Newton and Locke, in a movement that came to be known as the Enlightenment. Now, these philosophers called for the reform of old, irrational traditions, an end to aristocratic privilege, the free interchange of ideas, and in at least one crucial case, democracy. Now, some European monarchs, known as enlightened despots, tried to implement their ideas from above within the existing system, but in the end, they remained despots. Now, their failure to significantly change their society led some Europeans to consider alternatives, which is revolution. So we're going to break this up into two pieces. We're going to first look at a little bit of the Enlightenment period, some of the philosophers and their ideas, and then looking at the enlightened despots at the time. Now, as I mentioned already in the previous lecture, we examined an Ancien Regime, seemingly little change from what it had been like in the Middle Ages. Now, in the 18th century, European society remained strictly hierarchical and monarchical, with state, religions, and wealth, political power, legal privilege, and even access to entertainment, all concentrated at or for the top of that pyramid. But as we've seen, the 17th and the 18th centuries, from even previous lectures, saw some cracks in this hierarchical edifice. The Dutch Republic had pioneered non-monarchical government and religious toleration. The British Civil Wars of the 17th century aired notions of equality, religious toleration, and even popular sovereignty. And in the subsequent revolution of 1688 to 89, or the Glorious Revolution, installed constitutional government. And all across Europe, the middling orders were growing wealthier and more critical of aristocratic privileges and state churches. And above all, the ideas of the Age of Reason began to trickle down into the corridors of power in a process called the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was a period of time roughly from 1720 to 1820 when intellectuals applied the methods of the scientific revolution to political, social, economic, and even philosophical and religious problems. Most Enlightenment writers were popularizers, not original thinkers. Their work was read by kings, nobles, and the middling orders. Now, philosophe is the title usually given to these writers. The great ideas were popularized often in England as their origin. The Irishman John Toland, an early deist, argued in his work Christianity Not Mysterious in 1696 that nature itself is proof of God's existence, that everything valid in religion can be reduced to reason, and that anything that cannot be reduced to reason is nonsense. In the treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, published in 1710, Bishop George Berkeley, another Irishman, tried to respond to rational skepticism with a theory of subjective idealism. In other words, matter does not exist except as we perceive it in the mind. Now, this allowed him to posit an overall controlling mind, that of God. On the opposite end of the spectrum was David Hume, a skeptic and atheist who argued in the 1750s, in works so controversial that they were suppressed until 1779, that reason and rational judgments were merely habitual associations of sensations or experience. Now, the philosophers flourished from Scotland to Sicily and from Portugal to Poland. In Germany, Immanuel Kant agreed with Hume about the limitations of reason, but nonetheless sought absolute rules and that everyone could assent to and follow. But regardless of all these philosophers in Great Britain and in Germany, the heart of the movement was in France. François-Marie Arouet, also known as Voltaire, lived from 1694 to 1778. As a young writer, he was sent to the Bastille for satirical writings on the government. In 1726 to 1729, he fled to England and was overwhelmed by the relative intellectual freedom, the tolerance of different religious ideas and beliefs, and the openness of political life. In 1733 and 1733 and 34, first in English as Letters on England and then in French as Lettres philosophiques, Voltaire explained to Frenchmen and other Europeans Britain's constitutional monarchy, religious toleration, the scientific ideas of Newton, and the political ideas of Locke. Now, the book was an immediate hit and is often credited with launching the Enlightenment. Voltaire spent the rest of his life attacking irrationality, intolerance, and superstition in essays, fables, most famously his fable of Candide, and a philosophical dictionary. Now, these works led to charges of atheism and to exile from France. Voltaire did not seem to want to abolish monarchy, aristocracy, and the church, but to reform them. Denis Diderot, or Denis Diderot, lived from 1713 to 1784. He agreed with Voltaire on the need to banish bigotry and superstition. He saw the new science of the scientific revolution and rational thinking as the way to do this, popularizing it through his encyclopédie, or his encyclopedia. Diderot edited 28 volumes during his 1751-1772 period. Now later, the publisher added 5 supplementary volumes and a 2-volume index for a total of 35 volumes. Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu, lived from 1789 to 1755, another one of our philosophes. He argued that scientific study of man and his environment would yield the best possible government. In The Spirit of the Laws of 1748, he argued that the best governments mix, separate, and balance elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, to varying degrees determined by climate. Now, our last philosophe that we'll talk about is a gentleman by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he went further in giving the people a share of power. Now, Rousseau grew up in Geneva, which had a republican form of government. As a young man, he migrated to Paris, the heart of the Enlightenment, where he met the great figures of Enlightenment France in Parisian salons. His writings reveal him to be sort of an anti-philosophe. In his Discourse on the Origin and Foundation of the Inequality Among Mankind, published in 1755, he argues that reason is good, but that he found his heart a better guide to right conduct. Unlike Hobbes or even Locke, he asserts that man was happiest in the state of nature. Civilized society tended to corrupt man. In his work Émile of 1762, he argues for an educational system that emphasizes freedom of expression and self-discovery. And finally, in his 1762 Social Contract, Rousseau contends that big states are naturally corrupt and corrupting of the human spirit. And he argues for small states in which citizens know and trust each other, such as in Geneva. Further, Rousseau argues that government policy should follow the general will of the people. Now, these ideas influenced later democratic theorists, but also fascists, including Hitler. His autobiography, Confessions, published from 1782 to 89, though written and circulated much earlier, emphasized emotion and the moral ambiguity of adult life, thereby influencing Romanticism. Now, taken together, the philosophes seem to point to 2 possible courses of action. Before Rousseau, philosophes seem to have expected current monarchs and nobles to put an end to privilege and bigotry and spread intellectual personal freedoms and scientific progress. Only Rousseau suggests that the whole rotten system of the Ancien Régime should be abolished and power given specifically to the people. Now, both of these solutions would be tried. Rousseau's radical solution would bear fruit in the American and French revolutions. First, though, kings and nobles would get their chance. Now, neither Britain's George's nor France's Louis seemed to have paid much attention to the philosophes, apart from occasionally banning them in the latter case. Rather, it was three Central European monarchs who most assiduously read and tried to respond to the Enlightenment while retaining power in their own hands, hence the term Enlightened Despots. So we're going to look at all three of these. We're going to look at Catherine the Great of Russia, Frederick II of Prussia, and then Joseph II of Austria. So Catherine the Great of Russia, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, was the first Russian ruler since Peter the Great to have the stability of a long reign and continue his policies of reform and westernization. And to review just a little bit, Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, had been a sort of proto-enlightened despot. He reduced the power of the nobles, also known as boyars. He reduced the power of the Orthodox Church, especially a group known as the Old Believers. He reformed the army and established the navy, defeating Sweden in the Great Northern War for control of Baltic ports. And he compensated the nobles by making Russian serfs their personal property. In short, he made Russia a great European power, but at great cost in lives and cultural conflict. So to combat some of these issues set up by Peter the Great, in 1767 she named a legislative commission elected by all free men, above the rank of serf, to reform the law. And she also sought to westernize Russia even further by founding schools and encouraging publishing and journalism. However, a peasant revolt led by Pugachev in 1773 through 1774 caused it to turn authoritarian. Successful for a time, the rebellion was eventually crushed by the imperial army. Pugachev and numerous supporters were executed, and future reforms were designed to increase royal and aristocratic power and extend serfdom. Now, Catherine is known as the Great, mostly for her foreign policy success against Poland and the Ottoman Empire. Now, our second enlightened despot is Frederick II, or Frederick the Great of Prussia. And he also read the philosophes. Now, Frederick rationalized and simplified Prussian law. He encouraged industry and established tariffs to protect it. He promoted scientific agriculture. He encouraged the immigration of Prussia, of tradesmen and professionals, and he encouraged education, and finally sympathized with the American Revolution. Frederick remained a despot who reinforced an age-old hierarchical structure and squandered men and treasure in pursuit of military glory. Finally, we have Joseph II of Austria, who ruled from 1780 to 1790, and he was truly motivated by an enlightened concern for his subjects. Now, as regent for his mother, Maria Theresa, Joseph reformed and centralized the bureaucracy of the Austrian Empire in Vienna, forced the noble to pay taxes, and limited the amount of labor required of serfs. As emperor, Joseph reformed the law, declared religious toleration for all, dissolved the contemplative monasteries, and used the proceeds to endow hospitals. He imposed proportional taxation on everyone, imposed the German language on the whole empire for administrative efficiency, and he abolished serfdom and gave the emancipated serfs land. Now, these measures, of course, were opposed by the aristocracy, the Roman Catholic Church, and Belgians and Hungarians who resented having to conduct public business in German. Now, he eventually established a secret police just to watch over all his enemies. Joseph II died, worn out with care, just 10 years after his accession. Now, clearly the hope that a single, rational philosopher king, educated according to the enlightened ideals, could reform the Ancien Regime was premature. In any way, there was an alternative, one that came surprisingly enough from America. So this is the end of this lecture on the enlightened despots and the Enlightenment during this time period. In our next lecture, we'll be looking specifically at the American Revolution and how it used some of these enlightened ideas and proved that these enlightened ideas could actually be practiced.